One of the things we've done a lot of at Andjet is really try to mess around with building real-time applications. And real-time is one of those things that I feel has a giant pile of potential. I think we really haven't seen what it can be used for yet. As far as I really think we can push it a little further. And the first thing people always do is they go write some chat application, and that's interesting and it's totally useful, but it's been done, and it's every other week we get somebody that's like, oh, I wrote a chat app in 10 lines of code. Like, cool, way to go. And that's all great, but I really think that as this continues to get easier and easier and easier to do, we're going to see people using it for a lot more interesting things, and that's really what's so amazing about what SocketIO does for us. But so one of the things we have to keep in mind is, as web developers, is we're actually in direct competition with native applications. That's not really something people think about or talk about a lot, but the truth is, given the choice between using Gmail or Sparrow Mail for my Mac, Sparrow gives me a nicer experience, and that's what I use, and I end up spending money to some third-party Mac app developers to use Gmail. And the truth of the matter is, like, experience is everything, right? And I think one of the things that we've kind of done, I'm a little more of a front-end guy. My background is actually in business, not development. Got into this stuff later, but I think really got to keep in mind that recreating as much of the experience that people want from native applications in the web is very possible these days. But we're kind of stuck in this rut of feeling like we always have to support, we have to limp along all these old browsers. And I really think that's a mistake, and I think we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit on that. And I think the truth of the matter is it's totally fine. You go buy Microsoft Office in a box, you read the side of it, there's minimum system requirements. So what's wrong with requiring a modern free browser? The truth of it is, if you give a compelling enough reason to use those, the people will come and the IT departments will switch. If the business, if the big enterprise guys have good reason to actually get their people downloading Chrome or whatever it is, if there's enough of a business reason, the technological stuff goes away. So I think the trick is really, as web developers, to focus on basically stop supporting crappy browsers, because like I said, it's really not too much to ask. I think one of the biggest components of that, and one of the things that can make the most compelling argument for using really modern browsers, is the real-time stuff. I think there's a lot of collaboration tools and a lot of things that we haven't even thought of yet that you can do with real-time that people just need to start experimenting with and publishing, and just forget. SocketIO kind of makes it easier as far as supporting older stuff, but you know what? If your app requires WebSockets, so be it. Just use it. If it's got a compelling enough of an experience, then people will do whatever they need to use your app. And I think really that's the approach we should be taking, instead of this like endless reverse compatibility mode that we're kind of stuck in. And I know some people don't. You work in a corporation, you don't have that option. But I would just say, really, really, really want to stress this. I think that's important. And I think real-time is one of those things that can make that happen. So I would just suggest in general, and this is kind of a soapbox thing obviously, but really focus on providing the most compelling experiences and that you can. And I think real-time single-page apps is actually a great way to do that. And as browsers get better at integrating with the OS and everything else, you can do desktop notifications, background apps, all that kind of stuff. It's up to us as a community to actually use that stuff, push it, and show what it can be done with it. And that's what I'd love to see happen. So one of the things that I think is true for a lot of people are self-taught, right? And really, adoption is driven by how easy it is to start messing around with something. If you have to have this giant full stack development experience, and you have to know how to set up basically, to do real time, the way people started doing it was XMPP. It was one of the first approaches to doing this, and that's fine and that's great, and it's you've got this nice API and protocol to work with. and tons of libraries out there and whatnot. But you know, then you have to know how to set up and run an XMPP server along with everything else that you're doing. And the truth is, you know, your average front-end dev who's going to have to implement this isn't going to know enough to spend his weeknights, you know, like at home cranking out some real-time app. I mean, it can happen, but the truth is, the easier it gets, the lower the bar to the level of, you know, basically the lower the bar is to enter that and start messing around with it, the easier it's going to be, and the faster you're going to see adoption. And I think, honestly, I think that's what Guillermo's really done with SocketIO, because you can run Node. It's a single process. It's not that hard to set up on your machine, and you can just have this WebSocket server and just start sending messages back and forth. So, I mean, when I first started getting into web development, I mean, I was intimidated by Ajax until I saw how easy it was to do with jQuery, and I'm like, holy crap. So I think I've belabored that point enough. But the point is, it's getting a heck of a lot easier. So most of you, how many of you guys have actually messed with SocketIO? Okay, so most of you. But basically, it just makes it stupidly simple to send messages back and forth without having to think about the transport, without having to basically just. So on the server, all you do, you know, you got your normal little Node server, and then you can just start sending messages. I mean, you say listen to the server, and with the changes, obviously this is going to be a little different, but you can just send messages back and forth. So then on the client, you know, you just create your socket, and you say it's roughly the same API on the client, and you just send messages, and it's just nice, super simple bidirectional communication. You don't need to worry about serialization. You're working with the same language both places. It's quite simple, really. So, like I said, my first experience with all this was just using XMPP, and so we'd use Strofe.js in the client and actually, you know, connect as an XMPP client, turn the browser into an XMPP client, connect to some, you know, some other service, and start receiving XML. You know, then you've got to parse XML in the browser and all this other stuff. So it's really significantly more difficult. And the truth is, there's nothing stopping us from messing around with this stuff, and there's nothing stopping us from expecting that, you know, a browser can support what we're trying to accomplish. One of the most important things about building real-time apps, from what we've discovered, is state. So state is essentially just, I mean, if you can think of it as kind of a stripped-down way of representing just the core of what's in the application right now, as far as just data, and completely abstracted from views, everything else. So recently, I've done a lot of stuff with Backbone.js, and what Backbone does is it lets you create models that are separate from your views. So you create a Backbone model, and then you can bind changes to specific. You could say, for example, I care about this property. If this property changes, call this handler. Really easy stuff. But what happens is you can keep that data very kind of encapsulated in these models, and then anything that changes, you just respond to it. So your view is just, you know, your view gets past the model, and so your model, you bind changes to the model to your views. In this case, you just re-render the whole thing here in this simple example. I mean, you could dig in and re-render certain portions of it or change values or whatever you want. But, I mean, the point is, once you've abstracted your state, everything else just responds to that. And so one of the first apps that we use this for, Backbone is very much set up to do Ajax type architecture. So, you know, they've got kind of built-in methods for working with jQuery's Ajax stuff. So you write a REST API, and then you can just call, you know, you build your collection of models, and you just call fetch, and it will go make the server call, populate your models, and off you go, which is cool. And then what we did is, on top of that, so we would do an Ajax call, and then we would actually go subscribe to whatever items were brought back in an XMPP channel and start getting live updates through that. Again, it works, it's possible, but it's kind of tedious because you have to keep track of, I mean, at least your models are all living in one place. And really kind of this pattern of abstracting that into this little observable model state is definitely super helpful as a front end dev, because you just change everything that happens in your view. All it does is flip a flag in your model, and then your view responds to it. So what after messing around with Backbone and a little bit with SocketIO, I just thought, well, you get all these changes through Backbone, and yet you kind of do this Ajax thing, which is kind of not really. I mean, at that point, it's kind of asynchronous. You make a change, then you have to call save on that model, and then that serializes it, sends it to the server, and your server saves it. So when I realized that Backbone can actually run on the server as well, and that opens up some interesting possibilities, because what you can do is basically send the exact same model file. So you define your models once, you send that as a script tag to the browser, and you require it as a module in Node. And if you have a few other things, you can actually. So what I did is Capsule.js, all it does is it's an extension of Backbone, and what it does is it includes a way to nest models. So you have kind of one model that's kind of your root model, and you can add collections to it, you can add models to it, and you can serialize the entire state just off of that root model. There's an export function that you can just use to get that all out into its most concise state possible, which you can just send across SocketIO. Also, the change events that you get, there's no event bubbling by default in Backbone. So I implemented just a way basically to pass those events up the tree, just like you would in the browser, what you're used to there. And so you can listen for publish events on the root model. And so all these things combined, you can actually very quickly, basically init the exact same models on the client. As you get your connection, you just export the entire app state, send it to the client, and from there on, you can actually just let the change events propagate back and forth, which is there's clearly some interesting problems that come along with this as far as security and scaling and whatnot, but it's a really kind of fascinating way to build applications, because no matter where the change happens, it gets propagated everywhere. Or you can do it so that you can say the server is the authority here, and the individual client has to actually send a command that sets the change on the server, and then it gets propagated out. I mean, you can choose how you want to do it, and you certainly have to validate anything that you're using for permissions or anything like that, just to make sure that, because I mean, you could open a console in a browser and just edit the model, and those things would just propagate if you don't have it secured properly. But it makes, basically, if you're used to using Backbone, and if you're building your apps this way, it doesn't take that much to just get this set up and kind of have those events magically propagate. So as a little example here, this would be like your core app model, right? So what I've done is there's this little register function that creates a UUID for that model on the server, and then there's these add child collection, add child model type functions here, or the methods that you can use to build basically your tree of describes the structure of your application. And so then, on the server, what you would do is, what I'm doing right now, because I knew he was going to do something with making it easier to do sessions and user data and stuff for SocketIO. So I was kind of waiting for that, but all I'm doing is grabbing the cookie on the client and saying, hey, and sending it across SocketIO, which is kind of wonky, but it works. So basically, you go fetch you get this session event from the client, and you go fetch your user in the database, and whatever the corresponding app state that corresponds to that particular user, and then you just serialize the thing, send it out. And also you bind the changes for that publish event on that state for that client. On the disconnect, you unbind it. So it's fairly simple stuff, but it works quite well. So yeah, so all I'm doing on the client side is sending session across the wire, and then listening for messages. And the messages, basically, what I did is I came up with just basically a simple protocol for doing this. So you get your initial state, and then you get change events, you get add events, you get move events, and you get remove events. And then all you do is you look it up by that ID, which was generated on the server, and then you can just, whatever the change was, you just simply apply it on the other side of the connection. So, and it's really up to you as far as, what you want to do there. In theory, you can just have it so that any client can change anything and it just gets propagated. It completely depends on the use case for what you're trying to do. But so anyway, this is one of the little chat apps we built with it. This was all XMPP. But what we did here was actually kind of an interesting mixture of the two. So XMPP is fantastic as an external API, right? Because there's all these libraries out there that can use it. And for, say you want to write an iPhone app to go along with your application, and you need to provide that external API. If all you have is models living in memory and Node, it's really hard to kind of give access to that in some kind of predictable manner to some other client. I mean, you could write some custom HTTP API or whatever, but so anyways, what we ended up doing here is basically, in this particular use case, we just add this little chat bar at the bottom, and if somebody wants to go, open a new tab, we don't want to have to reconnect that with XMPP again. So what we did is just maintain an XMPP connection on the server for each client, and then everything else is being sent and synchronized through Capsule. So as a result, you open a new tab, it's immediately there. It's way faster to reconnect that way than having to reestablish that XMPP connection. So I mean, that's just one of the things we did with it. Another thing that we kind of been messing around with is this little app called Bang, and it's a collaboration app. And what we're doing here is we've got our entire team. There's like 10 of us, and so here we have a shared team state. And then members live within that. So your root state for the app is actually the team, and then each user is a member of the team, is somewhere down in the tree. So what happens is as you make changes to your tasks and whatnot, it just gets propagated to the rest of the team. And it's surprisingly quick, even if you decide you're going to set this stuff on the server initially, and then wait for the change to come back. It's surprisingly responsive if you're using WebSockets and you've got a decent internet connection. So I was going to try to do a little demo, but I don't know how big the screen is here. But I mean, just as an example of something you can do with it, right? So, and I don't even have the internet connection going here, but basically, so this whole thing is keyboard controlled too. So you can just add if I add a new task here, it's actually, what it's doing is it's sending to the server, it's saying, here's an add event. It's getting the change response, it's getting the add event back, and then the view is responding to that. And if we had multiple windows open of the same thing, the changes all happen simultaneously, right? So obviously we've got some CSS issues going on here, but the fact is, I mean, everything is simultaneous. It's super fast. It's super easy to work with. And the truth is, all you got to do is just modify the state. I mean, you're just setting values on this shared state, and everything else just kind of propagates and takes care of itself. We are definitely doing some. I mean, some of the obvious problems here are persistence and scaling and everything else. Because if you're going to have to keep the entire application state in memory on the server, there's some challenges there. So we're working on, actually my coworker Fritzy right here is, he's on the XSF Council of the XMPP, well, the XMPP Standards Foundation Council. And, so he's totally an XMPP guy. And what he's been looking at is basically writing, using Redis as kind of a shared memory for these types of applications. So basically, your register function that I called here would basically set up a feed in what he's calling Thump.js, and then you can use Redis as clustering to just, I mean, you can just tilt as many servers as you need to. So, and then pub sub events through that instead. There's definitely some other challenges here. As far as you know, in the case of the team here, you can't just have one view that responds to the same model for everybody, because you want every member of the team to have, you know, their view of that. So what we're doing is, instead of trying to, I messed around a lot with, in Guillermo's channels implementation thing would have been interesting, the multiplexing, because then you could have a team channel and you could have your own channel. But, you know, so what we're doing is basically, the members are further down the tree, but the view just identifies, you know, this user is X user. And then so as a result, anything that's specific to that user is getting set as a property of that user's model in the team. So the entire team state is still synced, but the, you know, your view just shows the correct one based on session ID of that user. So the other thing is, like I said, providing external APIs. And one of the things that Thunk does is basically you can have, Thunk is just a contract system with Redis, and so you could actually have just an XMPP interface to Thunk that just uses PubSub. You could have it write, you know, RSS or Atom feeds or whatever. So there's definitely some stuff there that's still missing that we're working on, but just, you know, not like here's how you should do real time, just kind of showing what we've been doing, what we've been playing around with, and kind of what we've found. Hopefully, hopefully that's useful to you guys. And anybody who has questions or anything, just any questions? Now.js, oh. Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at Now.js. My impression is that basically if you have this kind of magic object, and if you create a function on the client, that function becomes available on the server, which is interesting, and that's cool. It's just an abstraction on top of SocketIO, basically, right? But yeah, that would be another interesting architecture choice. But I mean, you could totally do that anyways. I mean, I've got a method in here for just, you know, call this method on this model on the server. Does basically the same thing. So it's cool. I mean, I haven't played with it a lot. But. Other questions? Oh yeah, I think I have one last slide, yeah? Okay, so Capsule.js is kind of what I wrote that adds those features to Backbone. I'd love to get more feedback on that. I know it's certainly not perfect, and I know this approach still has shortcomings, but we're going to keep playing with it and experimenting, see what we can do. And also, if any guys are interested in messing around with Anbang as a little pre-alpha something or other, just hit me up on Twitter and I can get some invites sent out, because we've got that almost to where almost ready to publish that stuff. So it's kind of that way you can at least have something that you can play with and see how it works as well. But yeah, and then just some other things here. One of the at JSConf, which I wasn't there at, but Func Unit it seems like a really cool way to test these types of apps, because basically you can just run. Basically, it's built on top of QUnit, which is the jQuery testing thing. But and you can it loads your app up in an iframe and says, hey, click this button, do this thing, and make sure that this, you know, wait for this thing to become visible, kind of thing. And it's a really awesome way to test these types of apps. But just as a little side note. So, well, thank you very much.